When we think about wealth, we usually picture enormous mansions, expensive possessions, or bank accounts filled with more money than one person could ever spend. But in the ancient world, being wealthy meant something entirely different. It was almost like living in a separate reality, far removed from the lives of ordinary people. You could order the construction of a flourishing garden in the middle of a lifeless desert, summon hundreds of people with a single invitation, or make your name famous across entire cities. Yet ancient wealth was also far more fragile and dangerous than it might appear. One disastrous political decision, an unexpected war, or the rise of an ambitious emperor could erase everything you had built almost overnight. Between 10,000 and 30,000 years ago, when humans still lived in small communities of hunters and gatherers, some individuals already possessed far more than everyone around them. They did not control armies, own banks, or live behind marble walls. Instead, they possessed rare objects that most people could never hope to obtain. Archaeologists know this because the dead often reveal more about the past than the living ever could. Paleolithic burial sites contain some remarkable evidence of early inequality. Most people were buried with almost nothing, while a select few were surrounded by carved mammoth tusks. Necklaces made from shells carried hundreds of miles from distant coastlines, pigments that required weeks of labor to collect, and obsidian tools of exceptional quality. None of these objects were necessary for survival. Their purpose was to communicate one unmistakable message: this person was different. Even more surprising is the fact that some of these richly decorated graves belonged to children only 2 or 3 years old. They were buried with more valuable possessions than almost any adult in their community. These children had never led anyone, achieved anything extraordinary, or proven themselves worthy of special treatment. They had simply been born into the right family. Inherited wealth, it seems, is at least 30,000 years old, and the desire to display it appeared almost immediately. The shells had to be transported from distant shores. Obtaining ivory meant hunting some of the largest and most dangerous animals on the planet. Every valuable object placed inside a grave served as a carefully chosen message to those who remained alive. This family holds power. This bloodline will continue. 30,000 years later, the meaning behind that message has barely changed. Only the materials used to deliver it are different. In ancient Rome, the most influential men began receiving visitors before sunrise. These visitors were not close friends or relatives. They were people searching for protection, money, favors, political access, or simply the opportunity to be seen near someone powerful. Long lines regularly formed outside the homes of Rome's greatest aristocrats. The longer the line outside your door, the more important you appeared. If that line suddenly became shorter, however, it could signal that your influence was beginning to disappear. In many ways, this was the ancient Roman version of social media. The difference was that your followers did not appear as numbers on a screen. They physically stood outside your home, waiting for a moment of your attention. Some powerful Romans could receive hundreds of visitors in a single morning. While crowds gathered outside, the interior of the mansion was already alive with constant movement. Servants carried water, prepared elaborate meals, and cleaned rooms that looked more like royal chambers than ordinary living spaces. The homes of wealthy Romans were not designed merely to provide comfort. They were carefully constructed to overwhelm and impress anyone who entered. Roman architects understood a principle that remains powerful even today. Wealth cannot simply exist. It must be seen. A visitor might first pass through several relatively modest hallways, only to suddenly emerge into a vast central room flooded with natural light. Fountains, sculptures, towering columns, and imported marble were positioned with one specific purpose in mind: to produce immediate astonishment. The wealthy people of ancient Egypt understood the same language of status and display. Their mornings often began with elaborate cleansing rituals that represented far more than basic personal hygiene. These rituals were also deeply spiritual acts. The dark makeup worn around the eyes of the Egyptian elite was not used only for beauty. Many believed it offered protection against disease and invisible supernatural forces. While millions of farmers worked beneath the burning sun, Egypt's ruling class strengthened the belief that they stood closer to the gods than ordinary people ever could. In Babylon, wealthy citizens offered daily prayers to the gods they believed protected their families and businesses. When trade was successful, prosperity was interpreted as a sign of divine approval. When business collapsed, the solution often involved larger offerings, additional ceremonies, and even greater expenses. Even a person's relationship with the gods could become another public demonstration of wealth. While the elite filled their days with rituals, luxury, and carefully staged displays of power, most people were simply trying to survive. A farmer could spend an entire lifetime producing food that he would never have the opportunity to taste himself. An enslaved person might devote decades to maintaining a wealthy household while owning absolutely nothing. From the perspective of the rich, this system seemed completely natural. They had been born into it and rarely questioned the foundation beneath their comfortable lives. Perhaps the greatest difference between rich and poor was not food, clothing, or the size of their homes. The true dividing line was time. Most people had almost no control over how their days were spent. The wealthy, however, could choose to read, hold long conversations, manage their estates, participate in politics, study philosophy, or simply sit quietly and think. The ability to control your own time may have been the most extraordinary luxury in the entire ancient world. Gardens deserve special attention because, in the ancient world, they represented far more than decorative spaces filled with flowers and trees. Today, a private garden may seem ordinary, but in many regions of the ancient world, maintaining a large ornamental landscape was an astonishing display of wealth. Imagine living in a place dominated by dry soil, scorching heat, and an almost constant shortage of water. Then imagine walking through the gates of a private estate and suddenly finding yourself surrounded by exotic trees, brightly colored flowers, artificial ponds, and fountains flowing day and night. Creating such a place required enormous amounts of money, labor, water, and planning. Only someone exceptionally wealthy could afford to spend precious resources on plants that served no practical purpose. And that was exactly the point. A magnificent garden did not generate wealth. It consumed wealth, and its very existence proved that the owner had more resources than he knew what to do with. The wealthy people of Babylon pushed this idea even further. If the land was too dry, they transported water across great distances. If the climate was hostile, they created artificial oases where nature itself appeared to obey their commands. If a rare plant grew hundreds of miles away, merchants, servants, and laborers were sent to bring it back. When you possess enough money and power, even the laws of nature can begin to look negotiable. The private rooms inside wealthy homes contained objects that most ordinary people would never see, let alone own. There were pieces of furniture created by highly trained craftsmen, expensive tapestries, elaborate jewelry, imported tableware, and books copied entirely by hand. Every object represented days, weeks, or sometimes months of human labor. The more difficult something was to create or acquire, the more prestige it gave to its owner. However, if there was one place where the ancient rich displayed their power most dramatically, it was around the dining table. Food was never treated as a simple necessity. For the wealthy, dinner became a public statement, a carefully planned performance, and sometimes even a political weapon. While millions of ordinary people survived on grains, bread, beans, and vegetables, the elite competed to serve the rarest and most unusual foods they could obtain. Serving delicious food was not enough. A successful host had to surprise the guests, overwhelm their senses, and create a story they would repeat for years. The performance began long before anyone tasted the first bite. Guests entered rooms decorated with rare fabrics, expensive furniture, sculptures, flowers, and carefully arranged lighting. Every visual detail was chosen to establish the host's status before the meal had even started. Servants moved quietly through the room, appearing and disappearing as though they were part of a perfectly rehearsed stage production. One dish followed another, one silver tray replaced the next. Every course was expected to introduce a new surprise. Wine held a particularly important place at these gatherings. The most strategic hosts did not necessarily serve the same wine to everyone. Different guests could receive different drinks depending on their rank, influence, or importance to the host. Imagine attending an extravagant dinner and realizing that the person beside you had been given a finer and more expensive wine. That tiny difference could become a source of embarrassment, resentment, and conversation for weeks. Among the ancient elite, no gesture was truly meaningless. Every cup, seat, dish, invitation, and serving order communicated a person's position within the social hierarchy. Once the meal ended, the entertainment began. Musicians performed while poets recited their work before the assembled guests. Dancers, actors, and acrobats were brought in to ensure that the atmosphere never became quiet or ordinary. The ancient rich seemed to possess a particular fear of silence. Perhaps silence left too much room for uncomfortable thoughts. In ancient Greece, these gatherings could evolve into long discussions about philosophy, government, morality, war, and the meaning of life. Of course, these serious conversations often took place after the participants had already spent hours drinking wine. Some of the most influential ideas in Western history may have emerged from rooms filled with intoxicated men arguing late into the night. History is often much stranger and more human than the polished version we are taught. Modern billionaires purchase professional sports teams, sponsor enormous tournaments, and place their names on arenas. In ancient Rome, the relationship between money, entertainment, and public approval was far more direct. The wealthy paid for blood. They paid for danger, excitement, and unforgettable spectacles. In exchange, the crowds praised their names and remembered their generosity. Gladiatorial games attracted thousands of spectators from across the city. The most successful gladiators became genuine celebrities whose victories were discussed in homes, markets, taverns, and public squares. An ordinary Roman might forget the name of a senator, but that same person could remember every detail about a gladiator who had survived an impossible fight. Wealthy sponsors understood this perfectly. That is why they competed to organize increasingly spectacular events with more fighters, more animals, more elaborate decorations, and more unexpected moments. Competition among the Roman elite never truly stopped. If one aristocrat financed an impressive event, his rival had to create something even larger. The goal was not simply to entertain the public. The real objective was to transform money into popularity, influence, and political loyalty. Chariot racing was even more popular than gladiatorial combat. Tens of thousands of people crowded into enormous stadiums to watch teams race at terrifying speeds. Spectators placed bets, screamed at opposing factions, celebrated victories, and mourned defeats as if their own lives depended on the outcome. The most successful chariot drivers earned astonishing fortunes. Some accumulated wealth that would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars in the modern world. They became the sports superstars of their age. This may sound surprisingly familiar because beneath the ancient clothing and stone stadiums, the system was remarkably similar to professional sports today. Crowds chose their favorite teams. Fans developed fierce loyalty toward particular colors and factions. Rivalries sometimes became so intense that violence erupted in the streets. The wealthy financed the spectacle, athletes risked their lives, and the public returned again and again for excitement. For the ancient elite, appearance was another lifelong obsession. The way a person walked, spoke, dressed, and behaved could reveal his social position before he said a single, meaningful word. Truly powerful people were never supposed to appear hurried. They moved slowly and deliberately because they could afford to make everyone else wait. That unhurried pace became a silent demonstration of authority and control. Fine fabrics, rare dyes, and expensive ornaments separated the elite from the rest of society. Some colors were incredibly difficult and costly to produce, making them visible symbols of privilege. Behind every carefully prepared appearance stood a small army of specialists. There were personal attendants, hairdressers, massage experts, perfume makers, clothing assistants, and beauty specialists. Wealth allowed the elite to delegate even the most basic parts of daily life to someone else. For the Romans, bathing was not simply about washing the body. It was a complete experience, a ritual, and an important social event. Large bath complexes included cold pools, warm rooms, heated chambers, massage areas, exercise spaces, and comfortable places for conversation. People came not only to clean themselves, but also to exchange information, discuss business, make political connections, and be noticed. The richest Romans did not always need to visit public bathhouses. They built private bathing facilities inside their own residences. Their homes could contain heated pools and sophisticated systems for moving and warming water. Meanwhile, millions of ordinary people struggled to obtain enough clean water for their most basic daily needs. That contrast captured the true scale of ancient inequality. For the wealthy, water could become entertainment. For everyone else, it remained a matter of survival. Behind all the luxury, beauty, and carefully staged displays of power, there was a much darker reality. The more wealth ancient elites accumulated, the more terrified they became of losing it. At first, that fear may seem irrational. These people owned enormous estates, commanded armies of servants, maintained powerful political connections, and possessed more resources than most families could accumulate over several lifetimes. But that was precisely the problem. They had far more to lose than anyone else. Modern wealthy people can protect their fortunes through banks, insurance policies, international investments, and relatively stable legal systems. For the ancient rich, those protections were either extremely limited or did not exist at all. A violent storm could sink an entire merchant fleet in a single night. One disastrous voyage could destroy years of trade and wipe out a family fortune that had taken generations to build. A sudden war could burn farms, destroy warehouses, interrupt trade routes, and reduce valuable properties to abandoned ruins. A rebellion could turn trusted servants into enemies. A political rival could spread a rumor that placed an entire family under suspicion. An insecure emperor could confiscate estates, money, slaves, and businesses with a single command. No courtroom, insurance company, or financial institution was guaranteed to protect you. Wealth offered extraordinary comfort, but it also created an enormous target. The richer and more visible a person became, the more enemies, rivals, and opportunists gathered around him. That is why almost every banquet, gift, public spectacle, and political favor served a second purpose. These displays were not simply examples of reckless spending. They were calculated investments in loyalty, influence, alliances, and personal survival. A wealthy Roman did not finance public games only because he loved entertainment. He wanted thousands of spectators to associate his name with generosity and excitement. A powerful landowner did not give expensive presents merely because he enjoyed being kind. Every gift created an obligation that might later be exchanged for information, protection, political support, or silence. Luxury could function like armor. The problem was that this armor required constant maintenance. Once a wealthy person began distributing favors and organizing spectacular events, people expected the displays to continue. If the banquets became smaller, the gifts became cheaper, or the crowds outside the mansion began to disappear, rivals immediately noticed. In elite society, any sign of financial weakness could spread like blood in the water. The same friends who praised you during prosperous years might vanish the moment your influence began to fade. Some would even move toward your enemies before your downfall was complete. Ancient wealth therefore demanded constant attention. It was not enough to become rich. You had to protect your fortune, display it, expand it, and convince everyone that it could never disappear. This exhausting uncertainty helps explain something that might otherwise seem unusual. Many of the wealthiest and most powerful men in Rome spent hours studying philosophy. They lived in a world where everything they owned could be taken away with terrifying speed. They needed a way to manage the fear that followed them through their marble halls. This is one reason Stoicism became so popular among members of the Roman elite. Stoic philosophers taught that wealth, status, health, and political power were temporary. All of them could disappear through events beyond a person's control. True peace, they argued, could not depend entirely on possessions or public approval. A person had to accept uncertainty and learn to control his response to whatever happened. There is a striking irony in that idea. Some of the richest men on earth devoted hours to thinking about why money should not control their lives. They lived among imported marble, rare art, private gardens, and armies of servants, while reminding themselves that none of it truly belonged to them forever. Perhaps they understood better than anyone how quickly fortune could turn. One emperor's death could elevate a family to unimaginable power. The arrival of the next emperor could destroy that same family before the month was over. Yet the deepest fear of the ancient elite was not bankruptcy, exile, or political defeat. It was death. Money could protect them from hunger, physical labor, and many of the daily dangers faced by ordinary people. It could provide better food, experienced doctors, safer homes, and servants who handled dangerous or exhausting tasks. But wealth could not purchase immortality. The elite of ancient Egypt confronted this problem by preparing for death with the same intensity they used to organize their lives. A wealthy Egyptian could spend decades planning and constructing a tomb. While ordinary families worried about surviving the next harvest, members of the elite were already arranging what would happen to them after their final breath. They commissioned burial chambers, decorated walls, gathered valuable objects, hired priests, and prepared detailed rituals. Every choice was intended to make the journey into the afterlife safer and more comfortable. For them, death was not viewed as a complete ending. It was a transition into another stage of existence. Naturally, the wealthy wanted to enter that new existence with the same comfort and status they had enjoyed while alive. Food, jewelry, furniture, clothing, tools, and sacred objects could all be placed inside the tomb. The dead were expected to need these possessions again. Even servants could become part of the preparation for the next world through symbolic figures, or in some periods and cultures, actual human sacrifice. Death did not erase social hierarchy. The elite expected inequality to follow them beyond the grave. But perhaps their greatest fear was not dying itself. It was being forgotten. To disappear from human memory was to suffer a second and possibly more frightening death. That is why rulers and aristocrats invested enormous fortunes in monuments, temples, statues, inscriptions, and gigantic construction projects. Stone appeared to offer something the human body could never possess: permanence. A person's body might decay, but a temple carrying his name could remain visible for centuries. An empire could collapse, but an enormous statue might continue staring across the landscape long after the language of its creators had disappeared. For powerful rulers, architecture became a weapon against time. They carved their names into walls, raised columns toward the sky, and covered entire cities with images of their victories. These monuments were not simply works of art. They were messages addressed to people who had not yet been born. They declared that this ruler had lived, conquered, governed, and mattered. Some emperors even attempted to remove their enemies from history by destroying statues, erasing names, and rewriting inscriptions. Memory itself became another battlefield. To control the past was to control how future generations would understand power. The strategy proved remarkably effective. Thousands of years later, we still pronounce the names of emperors and pharaohs who spent enormous fortunes ensuring that history would remember them. We study their tombs, photograph their monuments, and tell stories about their reigns. In that sense, their money purchased something close to what they desired. It did not allow them to live forever, but it allowed their names to outlive almost everyone else from their time. All of this extraordinary wealth rested on a reality that is impossible to ignore. The ancient world was built on slavery. Every perfectly maintained garden, overflowing banquet table, heated bath, polished marble floor, and luxurious private room depended on the labor of other human beings. Behind every beautiful display stood people who had little or no control over their own lives. Millions of men, women, and children were legally treated as property. Some wealthy families owned hundreds of enslaved people. Others controlled thousands. They worked as cooks, gardeners, cleaners, builders, farmers, secretaries, accountants, teachers, and personal attendants. Some were trained as doctors and cared for the same people who legally owned them. Others managed large estates, organized finances, supervised businesses, and educated the children of powerful families. One of the most disturbing facts is that many of the most educated people in the ancient world were enslaved. They could speak several languages, understand philosophy, practice medicine, manage complicated accounts, and teach literature. They possessed knowledge and abilities that their owners often did not have. Yet legally, these intelligent and highly skilled individuals still belonged to someone else. Their education did not guarantee their freedom. Their talent could make them more valuable without making them more independent. An enslaved teacher could shape the mind of a future senator while having no authority over his own future. An enslaved accountant could manage an enormous fortune while owning almost nothing himself. An enslaved doctor could save the life of a wealthy aristocrat while remaining legally classified as property. For much of the ancient world, this contradiction did not seem unusual. Slavery was treated as a normal and necessary part of society. It supported the entire structure on which elite comfort depended. The rich could dedicate their days to politics, philosophy, entertainment, and personal ambition because other people performed the exhausting work required to sustain their lifestyle. Someone had to grow the food. Someone had to carry the water. Someone had to clean the rooms, prepare the meals, maintain the gardens, heat the baths, and care for the children. Ancient luxury did not eliminate labor. It simply transferred that labor onto people who had no power to refuse it. This brings us back to the most valuable thing wealth could purchase. It was not a larger house. It was not another garden, an expensive necklace, a private bath, or a table covered with exotic food. The greatest luxury was something far simpler. It was time. Wealth gave people the freedom to decide how their hours would be spent. It allowed them to read, think, study, travel, debate, build relationships, manage property, and participate in politics. It created space for creativity, curiosity, and ambition. Most ordinary people could never afford that freedom. Their days were shaped by work, hunger, weather, debt, and the constant pressure to survive. They woke when labor demanded it and rested only when the work was finished. Their time belonged to the landowner, the household, the army, the state, or the person who owned them. For the elite, the ability to control time may have been more important than any object they possessed. A golden cup could be stolen, a merchant ship could sink, a mansion could burn. Political influence could disappear with the death of an emperor, but the years spent learning, thinking, and building relationships could shape an entire life. This may be the reason ancient wealth continues to fascinate us today. Behind the gold, marble, fountains, servants, feasts, and enormous monuments, we find desires that are deeply familiar. Ancient elites wanted to live comfortably. They wanted other people to admire them. They wanted to feel powerful, protected, and important. They wanted their families to remain influential after they were gone. Most of all, they wanted proof that their lives mattered. The scale of their ambitions may seem almost unbelievable. They constructed palaces that required generations of labor. They transformed dry landscapes into artificial gardens. They organized violent spectacles for tens of thousands of spectators. They accumulated fortunes large enough to influence entire cities. They raised temples, statues, and monuments in an attempt to challenge the passage of time. Yet none of these achievements could free them from the fears shared by every human being. They feared losing what they possessed. They feared betrayal from the people around them. They feared political change, war, illness, and death. They feared watching their names disappear from history. Money allowed them to hide these fears behind marble walls, but it could not make the fears vanish. The more they accumulated, the more carefully they had to protect it. The higher they climbed, the more painful the fall could become. Many of them lived with greater comfort than almost anyone else on earth, yet complete security remained beyond their reach. Empires rose, expanded, and collapsed. Powerful families appeared to dominate history, only to vanish within a few generations. Palaces were abandoned, gardens dried up, statues were broken, temples were buried beneath sand and soil. Entire cities that once seemed eternal disappeared from maps. The people who lived inside those cities probably believed their world would continue forever. They could not imagine that future generations would walk through the ruins of their homes and try to understand how they had lived. After thousands of years, we are left with fragments. We find jewelry inside tombs, mosaics beneath collapsed walls, painted pottery, broken statues, handwritten texts, and the foundations of enormous estates. Each surviving object offers a brief glimpse into a world where a small group of people enjoyed almost unimaginable privilege. At first glance, the wealthy people of antiquity appear to have lived in a universe completely separate from our own. Their clothing, customs, religions, governments, and technologies were different. Their homes were lit without electricity. Their messages traveled without phones, and their fortunes were stored without modern banks. Yet emotionally, they were not so different from us. They wanted comfort. They wanted recognition. They compared themselves to their neighbors. They competed for status and paid close attention to how others perceived them. They searched for ways to protect their families and preserve their achievements. They dreamed of leaving something behind that would survive after their deaths. The materials have changed, but the message remains remarkably similar. Ancient elites displayed rare ivory, imported marble, exotic animals, and enormous private gardens. Modern elites display private jets, luxury cars, exclusive properties, enormous yachts, and access to experiences most people cannot afford. The objects are different. The desire behind them is nearly the same. After watching entire civilizations rise and disappear, history leaves us with a surprising conclusion. The rich of the ancient world may have lived lives that seemed almost divine to ordinary people. But beneath their jewelry, political influence, and monumental architecture, they remained completely human. They possessed greater wealth, more servants, larger homes, and far better opportunities than those around them. Yet they carried the same fear of loss, the same desire to be admired, and the same hope that their lives would be remembered. They tried to defeat time with stone, gold, and power. Time defeated nearly all of them anyway. Perhaps the ancient wealthy were not as different from us as they first appear. They simply had grander monuments, more servants, and much better baths.